Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking into some really fascinating ancient wisdom.
Yeah, we've got a specific source lined up. It's a story from the commentary on the Dhammapada.
Right? It's called Aññatarakulaputtavatthu, which is, well, quite a mouthful.
It translates to something like the story of a certain householder. Pretty straightforward, actually.
And this story, it's not just a tale, is it? It gets into something deeper.
Exactly. It introduces this concept of stains or defilements, things that hinder us.
And it doesn't just list them, it actually singles one out as the supreme stain.
That's the core of it. So our mission today is really to unpack all of that.
Okay, so we'll explore the story itself, figure out what these stains actually are according to the text,
And, importantly, why the source considers them stains. What's the reasoning?
and then get to that ultimate one, the supreme stain, and maybe how the text suggests becoming stainless.
And it all kicks off with a situation that feels very human, involving a man and his new wife.
All right, let's dive in. Tell us about this householder, the Kulaputta.
Okay, so he's described as being of good standing, respected, and he marries a young woman, also from a good family, equal status.
Seems like a standard, maybe even promising arrangement for the time.
You'd think so, but the text hits you with the problem right away.
Oh.
From the very first day she comes to his home, she's unfaithful. Atikarini.
Day one, wow. That's quite a start to a marriage. How did he react?
He was deeply ashamed. The text uses the term Atikarini latito, ashamed because of her misconduct.
I can only imagine. That kind of shame must have been powerful.
It was so powerful, actually, that it completely changed his behavior. He stopped doing his usual things.
Like what?
Like visiting the Buddha, which was apparently part of his routine. He just withdrew.
So this personal crisis impacts his social life, his spiritual life,
Yeah,
everything.
pretty much. He isolates himself because of this intense shame.
So how long did this go on? Did he stay away?
Just for a few days, the text says, Katipahakiyana. Then he does decide to go see the Buddha.
Okay, so he overcomes the shame enough to seek counsel.
Yes, he goes, pays his respects, sits down quietly.
And presumably the Buddha noticed he hadn't been around.
Exactly. The source says the Buddha asked him directly, Upasaka, why haven't you been visible?
The upasakana disasiti, a gentle inquiry.
And the man,
He tells him. He confesses the whole situation, his wife's actions, his own shame, why he'd been hiding away.
putting it all out there. How did the Buddha respond to that kind of raw, personal pain?
Well, the Buddha's first response is interesting. He basically says, look, I've talked about this kind of thing before,
Oh, really?
but you didn't really get it back then. The text says it was because he was covered by existence. Bhavapaichanatta.
Covered by existence. What does that mean exactly? Sort of obscured.
Yeah, it suggests maybe he was too caught up in ordinary life or just wasn't in a place to really hear or understand the deeper teaching at that time. Blinded, in a way.
Okay. So what was the teaching he hadn't grasped? What did the Buddha elaborate on? He brought up an analogy from a Jataka story, apparently.
Analogy, okay.
He compared women, or perhaps certain situations involving women in that context, to public places.
Public places,
Like rivers, roads, taverns, assembly halls, watersheds. Yatanari kapanto ka panagara sabat papa.
huh, why those? What's the connection?
The point the text draws is about boundaries, or the lack thereof.
Ah, okay. Public spaces are open, accessible to anyone.
Precisely. The text says, for them there is no boundary. Vilatisana vijatiti. It's a metaphor, right? Pointing to a perceived lack of defined limits or predictability in certain dynamics.
So it's framing the situation as something inherently uncontrollable, maybe, like trying to control who walks down a public road.
That seems to be the implication, and based on that understanding, the advice comes.
Which was?
That a wise person, a pantitina, shouldn't get angry in such circumstances. Korona kotabodhi, don't let anger take over.
So facing this difficult, shameful situation, the first advice is manage your own reaction. Don't get angry.
Exactly. It shifts the focus inward immediately. And that's the perfect lead-in to the main teaching about these stains.
Mamalala.
Right. The Buddha then starts a discourse, beginning with the very issue at hand. A woman's misconduct is a stain, malathia dukkharita, and then he lists others.
Okay, so misconduct dukkarita is the first stain. Why? What makes it a stain in this context? We talked about the shame, but what else?
The text explains the chain reaction. The woman gets cast out by her husband. If she goes back to her parents, they might reject her too.
Why would the parents reject her?
They'd say she dishonored the family, basically. Shouldn't even be looked at. It's harsh.
So she ends up completely isolated.
That's the picture painted. Helpless, wandering, experiencing ma dukkha, great suffering. So the stain is tied directly to this devastating outcome, the suffering it generates.
It's not just the act, it's the ripple effect of suffering.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, what's the next stain on the list?
The next one is stinginess for a giver. Mataradatto mala.
What's your giver? That's specific. Dadato, meaning
Yeah, the text clarifies the akasa of the person who gives. So it's not just general stinginess.
it's stinginess in someone who actually intends or has the capacity to be generous.
Exactly. The text gives an example. Think of a farmer.
Yeah.
He plans to donate some of his harvest. Good intention. But then, as the crop ripens, stinginess creeps in.
Ah, that feeling of, oh, maybe I should keep more for myself.
Right. And that feeling, that stinginess, it blocks the generous impulse, kagachita nivareti. It prevents the generosity from actually happening.
And why is that specifically called a stain? Because the intention was there.
Because, the text argues, that blockage prevents the person from achieving what it calls the three accomplishments, tiso sampatio.
3 accomplishments, what are they?
Human wealth, divine wealth, and nibbana wealth, ultimate liberation.
Wow. So this specific kind of stinginess, blocking your own potential generosity, is a stain because it literally stops you from attaining worldly success, heavenly rewards, and enlightenment.
That's the idea. It obstructs that whole path of positive development. It's a hindrance to growth on all levels. And the text notes this applies more broadly, not just to harvests.
Okay, misconduct leads to suffering. Stinginess blocks attainment. What's the third stain?
This one's broader. Evil deeds, papaka dhamma, or akusala dhamma, unwholesome actions.
Unskillful actions. And the reason they're stains.
The text is pretty direct here. It says they are stains both in this life and the next. Italoke ka paraloke ka malameva.
In both worlds. And why? What's their essential nature?
Their nature is described as being destructive. Vinasana tayana malo. They fundamentally cause harm, destruction, ruin.
So misconduct, suffering, stinginess, blockage, evil deeds, destruction. There's a clear pattern linking this stain to its negative impact.
Absolutely. The mala concept seems inherently tied to negative consequences, to spoiling or hindering something good.
But then the teaching goes further. It mentions something worse than all of these.
Yes. Tatomala malata. Worse than those stains. There's a supreme stain.
And that is
Ignorance. Avijja. That's identified as paramamale, the ultimate, the supreme stain.
ignorance. That feels less active than misconduct or evil deeds. Why would ignorance be considered the worst?
It's a really crucial point, isn't it? It suggests that maybe those other stains, the misconduct, the stinginess, the harmful actions, they don't just happen in a vacuum. They might actually stem from something deeper.
Like, ignorance is the root cause.
That seems to be the implication, and the text even specifies it a bit. It calls it ahavatattukanyameva,
Which means
ignorance having 8 bases. So it's not just not knowing stuff. It's a particular, perhaps fundamental kind of blindness or misunderstanding.
Okay, so a specific type of ignorance is the foundational issue that allows all the other defilements to arise and cause problems.
That's how it's presented here. It's the bedrock defilement.
So after laying all this out, misconduct, stinginess, evil deeds, and finally, supreme ignorance, how did the Buddha wrap up this teaching?
He concluded with some verses summarizing the key points, reiterating the list.
Can you recall them roughly?
Something like, misconduct's a stain for a woman, stinginess for a giver, evil deeds are stains here and hereafter.
Right.
But worse than all those stains is ignorance, the supreme stain.
And the final call to action.
Having abandoned that stain, meaning ignorance primarily, but by extension all of them, bhikkhus, monks, be stainless.
So, directed at the monks in that specific verse, but the message is universal, surely. Abandon the stains, especially the root stain of ignorance, and achieve purity.
Exactly. It's the path away from suffering towards clarity and liberation presented through understanding these defilements.
And did this teaching land? What effect did it have on the people listening?
The source says it had a profound impact. Desanavasan, at the end of the discourse, many people attained high levels of spiritual realization.
Like stream entry.
Yes, so Padaphaladini, stream entry and other noble attainments. So it clearly resonated very deeply.
Amazing. It starts with one person's very specific, relatable problem, shame about his marriage. And it unfolds into this universal teaching about the nature of defilement and the path to awakening.
It's a beautiful example of how addressing a personal struggle can open up fundamental insights relevant to everyone.
Okay, so let's bring this back to you, our listener. We've gone pretty deep into this story from the Dhammapada commentary
Yeah, we started with that householder and his shame triggered by his wife's actions.
and saw how the Buddha used that moment not just to offer comfort, but to teach about these different kinds of stains or mala.
We looked at misconduct and how its stain is linked to the suffering it causes.
And stinginess, specifically in a giver, how that's a stain because it blocks potential positive outcomes, wealth, even liberation.
Then evil deeds, stained because they are fundamentally destructive. The why behind the stain is always emphasized.
And then the big one, the text pointing to ignorance as the supreme stain, avijja.
Suggesting it's the root from which the others might grow. A specific kind, too, that ignorance having 8 bases.
So this ancient text, born from a very human dilemma, gives us this framework. It helps classify the things that hinder us, that defile us, and points to the deepest one.
It really shifts the focus, doesn't it? From blaming external events or people to looking at our own internal landscape, the stones within.
Understanding these stains isn't just academic, according to this source. It's crucial for navigating life, for finding clarity, for moving towards being stainless.
It's practical wisdom stemming from a real-life problem.
Which leaves us with a pretty potent thought to mull over, doesn't it? If ignorance is the supreme stain, and the text specifically mentions ignorance having 8 bases.
What are those 8 bases? The text mentions them, but we didn't detail them here.
Exactly. What does that specific definition of ignorance entail? And how could understanding that potentially help us, in our own efforts to clear away that fundamental blindness? That seems like something definitely worth digging into further based on these sources.